Hello, good evening to all of our viewers and to our very distinguished panelists in tonight's session. I want to welcome you to the Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies Labor Day commemorative program in honor of George Weeks, entitled Week for Weeks, and hosted by the Elma Francois Institute of Research and Debate. My name is Ian Daniel, the Head of Labor Studies at the Cipriani College, and I will be your moderator for the evening. This is the last installment in our series of panel discussions in commemoration of Labor Day, a series that covered interrelated issues impacting the future of work, labor, and working people. This evening's topic is radical ideology and Caribbean working class institutions. This is a very important topic to myself and to all of the other panelists. And just to set the context, we want to give a short definition of ideology. So an ideology can be understood to be a system of social and political ideas in both theory and practice that attempts to explain and also to change the world. It's shared beliefs by which groups of people interpret and give meaning to the world and events happening around them. And it also helps people to distinguish themselves from others. Now, in a very strange way, in today's modern world, ideology has become a bit of a derogatory term and largely attaches to the isms, Marxism, socialism, communism, and feminism. And this has happened because other ideologies such as capitalism, neoliberalism, and free trade have become so widely spread that they've taken on the appearance of truth without alternative. So our panelists today are going to be challenging these representations of truth. Our panelists will look at the role of radical ideology in shaping both Caribbean labor and Caribbean societies. On our panel today is Akins Vidal, who is the coordinator of Elma Francois Institute for Research and Debate, our hosts, at Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies. And he will be looking at the early impact of ideology in worker organizations, primarily in Trinidad and Tobago. From Grenada, we have Andrew Lewis, the president of the Caribbean Congress of Labor, CCL, who will look at contemporary trade unionism and the role of ideology. And from Jamaica, we have Ms. Joan French, author, publisher, and activist, and she will be addressing the importance of feminist ideology for the advancement of the movement. So before we go into these presentations, let's have a small amount of housekeeping. Each of the panelists will speak for 20 minutes, roughly 20 minutes, even though Mr. Vidal has already indicated that he may not be able to stay within those boundaries. Mr. Lewis has valiantly volunteered to give Mr. Vidal more time should he need it. The viewers are free to ask questions of the panelists, and they can do this by typing your questions into the chat box on your screen. Questions should be clear and concise, and please state the panel member to which your question is directed. If your question isn't addressed during the session, don't worry. It will be answered at a later time, and that answer will be put in the comment section in the video. So please check the YouTube recordings of the panel discussions. Like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel. It will help us to stay on. It will help us to do more activities like this and distribute the information. So I think that's about as much as I want to say. Let's dive straight into the first panel discussion, the first presentation, which will be done by Akins Vidal. Akins is a lecturer in labor studies at Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies, which kind of like makes him my subordinate, which doesn't always stick, but anyway. He obtained both a master's degree and bachelor's degree in history from the University of the West Indies. He is also the coordinator of the Elma Francois Institute for Research and Debate at the college and has been doing yeoman's work in that area. Mr. Vidal has spent most of his adult life as both a community and political activist. He is a former president of the Trinidad Youth Council between 2007 to 2009, and a former executive member of the Federation of Independent Trade Unions and NGOs, and last held the post of General Secretary in 2012. Mr. Vidal has represented Trinidad and Tobago's civil society at several fora as both a delegate and presenter throughout Latin America and the Caribbean region, including Suriname, Curacao, Brazil, Nicaragua, Ecuador, Cuba, Venezuela, and several other Caribbean countries. He continues to write on social issues and assist civil society networks in whichever way is possible. So I want to present Mr. Akins Vidal, my friend, my comrade, and sometimes boss and sometimes subordinate. Mr. Vidal, take it away.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Mr. Daniel. Yes, thank you very much. I want to say for myself, good afternoon to all of the panelists. Good afternoon to those of you who are tuned in. My task is, I think, a difficult one, as it is for all of us, because this is an issue, a topic that is extremely controversial. We start in a negative space once you say the word ideology in the Caribbean. So what we're going to try to do, hopefully, is to have an open discussion. We're going to try to be as frank as possible. And hopefully in that, we help persons to see things a little differently and learn a bit about what we're doing and what we're trying to do as the labor movement and other civil society actors. So I want to start with perhaps a definition that goes against what a lot of people have in mind when they think of ideology in the region, because the first thing that they said that comes to mind is, and Ian said, it's some kind of ism. But I want to suggest that perhaps our working class consciousness is the ideology. The working class consciousness is the thing that we're trying to achieve. But what is it? I'm suggesting that in the Caribbean, this is an indigenously evolved ideology. It is formulated as a response to the condition of enslavement. We have to go all the way back. I'm suggesting as well that it has a peculiarity in that it is, and this is my phrase, it is an anti-ideology, in that it targets a set worldview and proposes an antithesis, while simultaneously trying to make the worker whole. Because you must remember that this worker in the region comes from this condition of enslavement. And so that person is not whole. There are things about that person that imposes some limitations. And the world that that person exists in imposes limitations upon that individual. So this person is trying to make themselves whole. This is the worker trying to envision a different world. And this world is unknown because it is not part of our current state of consciousness, because we have not experienced a world where the workers have actually self-actualized in the Caribbean. We have not experienced a world where we are whole as a Caribbean people. We're still carrying a lot of pain, we're still carrying a lot of hurt, there's still a lot of gaps that we have. And my position is that we don't know what that world will look like after this workers' revolution that we keep talking about. We have no clue what it will look like, but we fight for it anyway. And that in and of itself creates its own challenges for us when we try to articulate and argue for the rationale behind it. So I hope that that starts to frame what I want to talk about. What we have been doing a lot, and Ian spoke about it in his definition of ideology, where we talk about different worldviews. This particular image is shared a lot, where you have two individuals on either side of a figure, one arguing that it's a 6 and one arguing it's a 9. And then you have, just because you are right does not mean I am wrong, you're just not seeing life from my side. For me, however, that's not what this image means. This image depicts two individuals who are not prepared to even engage in fact-finding. Because the reality of the situation is, if you engage in critical thinking, that image on the ground was drawn by someone, was put there by someone, and they would have had an intent, and their intent would have been either to produce a 6 or to produce a 9, which does not then change because you decide it is a 6 or a 9. So what we have here is, in my view, a challenge within our society where we're constantly having these debates of false consciousness. We're having these debates about things that we think we're having differences on, but we're having differences and arguments about differences about things that would be resolved if we simply do some fact checking, if we simply deal with the facts in front of us. So this really speaks more to a level of individualism within the society, which counters the collectivism which is promoted both by Afrocentrism and the working class consciousness that we're trying to promote. In 2019, so I hope that in that image there, I'm trying to dismiss or at least put on the table that simply because you have a different position from someone, that is not a difference in ideological positioning necessarily, especially when we're dealing with facts that can be verified. Last year, in 2019, I was on a panel for the CCL. And in this panel, I started off by saying that there's a myth in Trinidad and Tobago, and I want to start by countering it, and that is by saying that 𝑘𝘶𝑗𝑚𝑚 is not one. This callaloo hodgepodge that we pretend that Trinidad and Tobago, as Brother Valentino sang in the 70s, Trinidad and Tobago is a paradise, Trinidad is nice, and he sang it facetiously. The reality is that Trinidad and Tobago is not a paradise. We are not one, and that there are multiple interests at play continuously. And that if we don't, especially as workers, recognize that there are multiple interests at play, we could very well find ourselves doing things inimical to our own existence because we're on the wrong side. So in October, and this was the same day of the meeting, this is an excerpt from the Trinidad Guardian, and it says, thousands of drivers were left affected yesterday as Unipet's 21 service stations across the country remained closed when dealers sought to send a message to the government that the profits they were making were too low for them to consider staying in business. And I asked, fortunately, at that table was also the president of the Employers Consultative Association. And I asked him, at what point in the day are you going to release a statement condemning the act of the Unipet owners? Because had it been the trade union that had shut down all 21 gas stations, ECA would be out in front talking about holding the country to ransom, talking about how irresponsible workers are, talking about the state of the economy, and all kinds of other things. And workers would join in that chorus. There were crickets, nationally, crickets. Here, an employer shuts down an entire industry, and there are crickets in the country. Whereas if that had happened on the other side and the workers had done it, there would be an uproar. That is what differences in interest and differences in ideology, that's how it plays out. And that is what happens when worker consciousness is low. Because worker consciousness is low, or rather, to use the way that I've put it, workers do not buy into that working class ideology. You find that they latch on to ideas that are not necessarily in their own interest, and you end up having workers attacking workers or workers supporting employers. So I want to move quickly now to deal with the isms that we, as Ian put them in his own introduction. So I want to deal with 4 very quickly, and one is Afrocentrism, which I'll deal with in the pre-emancipation period, Pan-Africanism and Garveyism, and how important those were for early organization and mobilization. The 2 forms of socialism that actually do have a presence in Trinidad and Tobago, and that would be Fabianism, which really pervades the entire region, and a form of Marxist socialism. And then a unique one, again, indigenous to us, which is Butlerism. And that comes from the work of Uriah Butler, of course. So let's start with our pre-emancipation argument. And I will, hopefully what I say makes sense and everything connects. So Antigua, the Haitian Revolution, Taki's Revolution in Jamaica, Grenada 1796, Barbados, all of these rebellions, and this is just a drop in the bucket of the rebellions that would have taken place during the period of emancipation. No one questions whether these rebellions were legitimate or not. But let me not say no one, because the colonial authorities did question them. None of us, as descendants, as being part of this African diaspora, question why these activities took place. And on top of that, the reason we didn't question it is because the inerring nature of the system of enslavement suggested, or would suggest to you, that this is a natural and normal response. The point I want us to take away from this here is that because of the nature of enslavement, the nature of that colonial experience, the nature of that plantation experience, the African on the plantation who was enslaved did not need a European ideology to tell him or her that slavery was bad. Did not need a European ideology to tell him or her that we need to get out of this, that we need to organize, we need to mobilize, we need to end this thing, we need to have revolution, we need to have rebellion. No, that happened organically because of the nature of the system, and because obviously the African themselves were more conscious of their state than we give them credit for. And we don't have time for this, but there are lots of problems with some of the narrative that still hold on this period of enslavement. So I want to deal with this question now. Does emancipation correct the situation that existed that caused all of these rebellions? And I want to say, quite frankly, the answer to that is no. And if you hold that emancipation does not correct those challenges which exist during the period of enslavement, then the same rebellion, for the same reason, is going to be part of the post-emancipation period. But more than that, let's think about the individual. There are several narratives that held in our history books for a long time, and it's only very recently that we're doing some revisions. So you still have narratives that the African was emptied completely, or empty glass, or empty vessel. So this person is just existing at the whim and fancy of the colonial master. I don't hold that view. I hold the view that while there was definitely cultural suppression, right? Your culture is not something that you walk with in a briefcase that could be taken away from you so easily. So there was definitely cultural suppression, and there are many things that we were able to retain. That is not to say that those things were not under attack. So you can either have, but either way, if you have the person who's completely empty or half full, when we talk about making the person whole, which is what these rebellions and this resistance is about, what are you filling the rest of that glass with? That's the question. What are you filling this person with? This person who now comes out on the other side, this person who is now trying to make themselves whole, who is latching on to whatever ideological position pervades the society, whatever attitudes, norms, and values pervades the society. Just imagine for an instant if this African who has now been emancipated latches on to the colonial ideology that just had him or her enslaved, that latches on to a thought process that sees this group as less than human, that attacks this group. Imagine if we had persons filling and becoming whole with that. That is the contradiction that we have, that it is not, ideology is not about what you look like, it's about what you think. And that is something that we have to understand and come very clear with when we deal with the idea of working class solidarity, working class consciousness. So I want to propose, so we have here some images, Toussaint from Haiti, Mary Prince from Bermuda, Nani from Jamaica, Henry Sylvester Williams, and Marcus Garvey. So we have pre-emancipation, post-emancipation, and I'm proposing that there's a common thread that pulls everything together, that emancipation as a date does not disconnect the pre-emancipation rebellion and resistance movement from the post-emancipation resistance and rebellion movement. And therefore, both the ideology and the consciousness from those periods also have a common thread and also are on a singular continuum. So I'm suggesting that the first major ideological influence for workers in the region, because we have to recognize that the African on the plantation was a worker. The indentured Indian who comes after is also a worker. Okay, so the first major ideological influence is the Afrocentric consciousness. Why? Because that person is trying to fill this glass that is either completely empty or half full, depending on which narrative you agree with. But we know for sure that there's something missing in the glass. So both of these, this Afrocentrism would manifest both as Pan-Africanism and as Garveyism, both of which speak to or shaped the ideology of the working class and promoted need for structured organization. In fact, Belgrave in Dare to Struggle talks about several rebellions and the reports from those rebellions identifying that even in the period of enslavement, you have structured rebellions. Rebellions are not haphazard, they're not all over the place. They're structured, they're well organized, well coordinated. And therefore, in the absence of the trade union, in the absence of those workers' organizations that will come later, there's already a process of organization and mobilization. As we jump quickly into the 20th century, racism is everywhere. I mean, Dr. Eric Williams argues that slavery was not a product of racism. Whether you believe that or not, the fact is that after slavery, the entire region is racist. The system is racist, plantation economy is racist, and there's no getting away from that. There's no getting away from that. You have to face that head on, the entire world, and we're still dealing with these issues up to today, the issue of race, prejudice, of institutional racism, which many people don't understand. In institutional racism, you don't even have to have a racist running the country for you to exercise racism on the mass of the population. That's how it works, and most people don't understand these principles. So throughout 1919, the local press, and people were very aware of this, Britain, major anti-Black riots in Liverpool and Cardiff. You have the murder of a Trinidadian seaman, Charles Wotton, a war veteran. All of these things are heightening and informing the racial tensions within the British West Indies. And workers are responding to this. So in 1917, 1918, 1919, throughout the region, in Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago, we have the waterfront riots. You have waterfront riots in Guyana as well around the same time. In Puerto Rico, in Cuba, even in the Spanish speaking, there's a commonality of rebellion just around this time because it also coincides with the end of the First World War and repatriation of a number of soldiers who themselves had experienced racism and came back into the region with a newfound level of consciousness that they had not had prior to their experience. And I just want to deal with the last two, Ian. I hope that I'm doing okay with time. Marcus Garvey, and his UNIA. Why is so Marcus Garvey is influencing our local TWA more than Marx and Lenin. And why is that? Because Garvey's work and what Garvey is promoting has a direct synergy with what is already happening in the region. And so that Garvey's nationalist movement, Garvey's work is not a distant theoretical thing for the people of the Caribbean, and they latch on to it. And Garvey also was heavily involved in trade unionism himself. So Garvey's writings also dealt with workers' rights and also dealt with workers becoming whole. So his UNIA, Trinidad and Tobago, has actually well, I don't know, historically, we had the second largest number of branches of the UNIA outside of Jamaica and Cuba. So you have here this individual, Marcus Garvey, his work in particular in forming the Trinidad Working Men's Association. How do we talk about radical ideology transforming an organization? Well, the TWA starts in the late 19th century, reforms in 1906 under Alfred. Alfred, however, is a reserved leader, and it is de Bourgh and others who are themselves members of the UNIA who come into power with a mini coup in 1918, and that period between 1919 and 1923 is perhaps the most active radical period of the TWA, and it is the time when they establish themselves as a real working class organization defending workers, because they recognize and hold the view that they must be more than the Fabian kind of agitator about reform and lobby, and that those things go only so far. And it really is the fundamental mobilization of the workers in the street and understanding that it is the core of the society that has to be changed, and it's not about simple reform. Fabianism, as I said, that really comes into the region through the British Trade Union Congress and eventually British Labour Party. So they have members who come to the region starting in about 1906, and they travel through the region and they meet with trade union leaders and they tell them about this Fabianism. So somebody like Arthur Cipriani would have been Fabianism. So he held strongly to the view of reform, and reform as the means and mechanism that trade unions should go through, because what they promoted was responsible trade unionism. And interestingly enough, both the Moyne Commission into the 30s and the Foster Commission into 1937 in Trinidad and Tobago also speak to this idea of responsible trade unionism, which really was a trade union that didn't shake the boat too much, but that did enough to make workers feel as if something was being done on their behalf, and focused on some degree of industrial relations exclusively and avoided the political discussion, because the political discussion is the one that attacks the construct of the state. And the Fabianism stayed away from that. And if you see in the end here, it says that they provided a reformist alternative to what they call the spell of Marxism in Britain. And we know that Marxism was about revolution and transforming the state fundamentally. Okay. There was some Marxist influence in the region. George Padmore, the most famous of the, I would suggest the most famous of the Marxists in this period here in the 30s. He would have, through his organization, had an influence on people like Elma Francois, would have had a relationship with Headley and Gittins, Jim Headley, who would have been in the US, Gittins, who would have been deported from France, both of whom being part of the communist parties in those respective territories, and then coming together. So Francois, Headley, Gittins coming together to form the NWSCA, and they would have been the voice discussing the invasion of Ethiopia. So even though there's a strong Marxist position, Marxist socialist position, the fact is that the mobilizing component was still based in Afrocentrism, and that is the invasion of Ethiopia. So we have to be clear on that. And so while, yes, Marx is relevant in terms of analysis of the region, I want to propose that a wholesale copy of Marxism or imposition of Marxism doesn't necessarily work. And I think that many of us, in fact, have, right, and I think that many of us perhaps have misinterpreted how Marx ought to be applied to an environment anyway, but that's for another later discussion, right? And then the last one now, Butlerism. Okay, so in 1921, Butler comes to Trinidad, but Butler has also experienced the war. So Butler is coming with that consciousness, quite apart from the work that he's already doing in Grenada. So Butler doesn't come to Trinidad as some empty vessel waiting for Trinidad to teach him how to be a radical, waiting for Trinidad to teach him how to fight. He comes with that. And he also comes with a strong spiritual Baptist base. And those things combined with his own fight for people of African descent, creates this rebel, if you will. And I want to, right. And this is my last slide here. So we have perhaps the most important of the isms, and that's the Butlerism. What distinguishes Butler from his contemporaries was his devotion to what Jacob describes as the class concept philosophy of trade unionism. So the class concept philosophy holds two things. On the one hand, it talks about preservation of reasonable profitability and to maintain good industrial relations, mainly to prevent strikes, so you reduce the amount of downtime. On the other hand, it talks about the interest of the worker and the employer being at odds with each other, and that each seeks to protect and project their own class interests. So you have here in Trinidad and Tobago where we describe unions as either being Fosterite or Butlerite. So those unions that hold the view that the worker interest and interest of the employer are not the same, those unions are recognized as Butlerite unions. I don't know that we necessarily have that widespread, and some of my comrades might be upset that I've said that. But if we go back to our full circle, the difference in interest really comes down to a difference in ideology. It comes down to a difference in terms of how I see the world. How am I interpreting this world around me? How do I want to fit into this world? What is my ideological position? What is my class consciousness? Is my class consciousness one where I see the class as having an interest distinct in and of itself, which is what Butler proposed? Or do I see my class interest as a subset of the interest of another grouping? And therefore, I am interested in harmonizing my interests with someone else's. And there are many things about us that, for me, suggest that we should be in the second phase because we are not yet complete in this task of making ourselves whole, of dealing with the pains of enslavement, of dealing with the pains of indentureship, of dealing with the pains of colonization and colonialism. And we are in large part a very broken community, and a lot of work is being done to make us whole again. And hopefully some of what we contribute here will also be part of that process. So with that, I want to end and thank you for allowing me this space to make this contribution.
Well, thank you very much, Atkins. I think we now know what it feels like to sit in one of Atkinson's history classes, which Brother Andre enjoys immensely. But I can tell you that his students sometimes wonder, why do we inflict this man on them when all they're doing is a certificate or an associate degree? You see that he is a historian. And what Atkins went into in his presentation was that historical line drawing from slavery down to nearly contemporary times. He identified an indigenous anti-ideology, which is a very interesting term, and recognizes that the ideology that developed organically in the Caribbean was one about making oneself whole, a very poetic term in and of itself. He talked about ideology inhibiting critical thinking, where those of us who lack a solid grounding in class consciousness end up debating false identities, and points to the importance of the slavery experience, of the colonial experience in producing a natural, organic, nonism ideology in the Caribbean region. He looked at also one of the more interesting parts, the post-emancipation Fanon contradiction that develops with the question of if we are half full as a result of the colonial experience, as a result of the slave experience, what do we fill the other half of the glass with? And then he drew that workers' ideological continuum from the Afrocentric consciousness through Garveyism, Fabianism, Marxism, and finally Butlerism. And he asked the question, are we yet whole? Which is a very profound question that leads one to ask, what is the future of the working class as we try to define ourselves, as we try to define our movement into the future? Akin's very interesting presentation, very interesting discussion. I look forward to the questions and see what kind of discussion is generated out of them. So we want to move on now to my comrade president, Andrew Lewis, the president of presidents. Andrew Lewis is from Grenada, my second home, hopefully. He is the President General of the Grenada Technical and Allied Workers Union. He is the President of the Grenada Trades Union Council. He is the President of the Caribbean Congress of Labor, and he represents labor in the upper house of the Grenada Parliament. Andrew Lewis represents the GTUC on the Committee of Social Partners in Grenada and on the Steering Committee of Grenada's National Sustainable Development Plan 2020 to 2035. He also served on the Monitoring Committee between 2014 and 2017 of the Grenada's Homegrown Structural Adjustment Program 2014 to 2016. Ladies and gentlemen, Comrade President Andrew Lewis.
Thank you, my dear comrade. And I can't start without once again complimenting my comrade and brother Atkins for his contribution, which is aptly needed in this period, and we need to make more use of him in these discussions. As a matter of fact, we first say good day to everyone else. In Grenada, we had Comrade Atkins in a historical month of March 2020 at the start of the pandemic, when they ran a few days of session for the working class here in Grenada. Comrade Ian, thank you, and to Cipriani, thank you for this exercise. To the listeners and viewers, good afternoon to you. I wish to pay homage to this bearded, berry-toting, working class hero, Comrade George Wicks. As I start off, his image with his berry flash in his militant style, bearded, speaks volumes of someone who was independent in thought and fearless in his representation of people. And to me, these images are important. Accepting that they existed, as Comrade Atkins have indicated, the early formative years of organized Caribbean working class struggle, an ideology or set of ideologies that influenced and shaped and guided the different movements. My presentation's discourse will center on current trade unionism practices and ideologies, for want of a better word. We must recognize and accept that quite a number of our leaders And my focus would be probably going back to probably 40 years, 50 years, but most over the last 20 years or so, because it's important in terms of contemporary issues. Quite a number of our current trade union leaders have been influenced by various movements in time, has been articulated by Comrade Atkins. And I want to go straight into the aspect of the influence of the movements on the labor movement, and the leaders of the labor movement must be seen in the context of the wider societal issues and just not what I refer to as narrow trade unionism or narrow economics, meaning that it is salary increases, working hours, but on the issue of the interests of leaders and all of us in the wider societal issues. So the movement for unemployed people, for organized people, for unorganized, and concerned about living conditions, not just at the workplace, but the issues in the society. And I will step off here with the experience of workers and the influence that a particular movement or a particular process had on the lives of the Grenadian working people, and I dare say the wider Caribbean region, if not the world, the Grenada Revolution. The Grenada Revolution did sought to change the society. As a matter of fact, it was not just about another society, but the intention and policies were about a just society. And what sticks to my mind as I move back and forth, 3 weeks ago, I had a very surreal experience with a former leader of the National Women's Organization, NWO, one of the arms of the revolution. And that would give us the importance of political power and political influence that the labor movement and trade unions must be involved in. And that sister, speaking to her at her home, we are speaking about the need for that sort of consciousness and that lack of consciousness that is taking place now, or absence of consciousness in this issue. And she said, I was speaking of someone who is now a doctor. That's the son of, well, a lady. And in speaking to the lady's background, that she worked on an estate and with involvement of Cuba and people being able to break the barriers and get tertiary education to come back and develop the society. And she said, but do you know how the PRG, that's the People's Revolutionary Government, passed into law equal pay for equal work, or equal pay for both male and female, man and woman? She said, at the Bellevue Estate, a government estate in St. Andrew, Comrade Maurice Bishop, Prime Minister of Revolutionary Grenada, visited the estate. And on the estate, that sister female worker was digging a drain, doing manual work. And when Comrade Morris came, she said, Comrade Brother B, I am doing work here just as them men, but yet still I'm paid less than them men. And right on the spot, Comrade Bishop said, we'll take care of that. And within a short space of time, the law was amended to stop that discrimination between man and woman in terms of pay. And that is significant because laws are made in our parliaments. And if the people in our parliaments do not share the working class vision and working class dreams that we have, then the battle becomes harder. So I'm just positing that there. I'm positing that there in terms of what is needed. In a sense, comrades, the ideologies of the revolution continues, or the dreams of the revolution continues. And you can hear it because most political parties and most organizations today in Grenada are compared by what people read about and what people experience about the revolution. Because anyone in their 40s, early 50s, living in Grenada would have experienced that particular period. But we must also remember that the labor movement in Grenada during that period moved by leaps and bounds, because the same revolution was able to pass the Trade Union Recognition Act. The same revolution was able to pass that employers must meet and treat with unions. The same revolution was able to pass that no longer should trade unionists be going to stand at the work centers trying to collect union dues, but that these can be deducted by the employer. And where it is not union dues, what you call service contributions, then the employer is obligated to make that deduction. These would have lent itself to the strengthening of the labor movement. But instructive to note also is the role played in terms of ideologies, in terms of the Black Power movement. Because a number of our leaders, present leaders in the labor movement and leaders of the revolution, were deeply involved in the Black Power movement. Our research will show and our experience in speaking with them. And here Trinidad stands out extremely proud. Makanda Daniel, Taga, whose contribution to Black consciousness and ideas of revolutionary consciousness is second to none. And around those times too, you had the liberation movements, the revolution in Grenada, 79, the revolution in Nicaragua, 79, the Iranian Revolution, coming on the heels of the Cuban Revolution, coming on the bringing to life of 𝘑𝘶 after his death. By killing 𝘑𝘶, he has been given life. And these things have all influenced quite a number of our leaders. But there's no doubt that in this period, we have recognized a slowdown in what one calls this working class ideological outlook. And a lot of it has to do with the aspect of what one calls individualism, where our society today is so much on a consumerist approach, where a number of us as trade unionists, and I'm taking collective responsibility, we all have to do that. I think we have, to a large extent, been extremely successful in representing the narrow interests of our members, by and large, in terms of making quite a number of them rich, by making a number of them get very decent income, while at the same time not building on what we call working class ideological studies. And we accept it here in Grenada, and I dare say it is part of the wider Caribbean, that this is a fundamental flaw that we must accept and we must try to address. The question here is, and I'll just read off this: one union, one struggle. All units do battle. One movement, one struggle. All unions do battle. OWTU. We will never walk alone. BITU, Jamaica. These mottos speaks to the intention and objective, by and large, of these organizations. And I took it Jamaica in the north, Trinidad in the south, and one may say that within the labor movement, you will find, in terms of what one may call isms and schisms, on varying levels, what some may call Marxist, socialist, revolutionary. But what is common, in my view, and from our interactions from the different organizations, regardless of what pigeonhole that one may have placed them in terms of the isms and schisms, there's common agreement on the issue of what you call justice for workers. That recognition that we need to try to get more from the employer class. And it varies, as I said, in relation to how far one wants to go into the societal issues. But let us also not forget the role of music as a consciousness building. Reggae music, for instance, as an expression of the oppressed and a call to battle. And for a number of comrades, regardless of the ideological outlook, we find that the influence of a Bob Marley, the influence of Rastafarianism, the influence of Peter Tosh, to name a few, has been significant. As a matter of fact, in quite a number of our struggles, during protests, you'll find those sort of music being played today. And you will find that notwithstanding the fact that we have lost some levels of consciousness, that even on our May Day, for instance, in Grenada, International Workers' Day, you find that less conscious music has been played, and it is more what you call the dance, well, I shouldn't just say dancehall, because dancehall also have progressive lyrics, but some of the lyrics leaves a lot to be desired. The younger population, the younger generation, which we have sort of left in the wilderness, sort of gravitate to the kind of more consumer music. But however, when we are in an industrial dispute, it is the Marley and the Peter Tosh music that people call for. And please do not underestimate the value of Sparrow's Capitalism Gone Mad. Succinctly put, for the people who listen to those music, and therefore we have the tools on our hands to influence the younger generation, to be able to listen to what one will call conscious music, to help steer that outlook for the wider societal issue. We must not be afraid to accept and to pronounce that our interest is to not just get betterment for our people, for the working class, but to proudly and boldly state that just as how the employer class is out to maximize profit, just as how in the midst of a pandemic, supply and demand is at play, that there is no consciousness to reduce the profit margin, we must also be proud to say that we have no apologies in seeking to get more from the employer class to better the working class. Many times we are afraid, and the employer puts us on that back foot by saying that all the unions are interested in is salary increase. All the workers are interested in is looking for betterment for the members. Well, that is why we represent them. We will cooperate because we have to coexist. But you must know, the employer class must know that in our coexistence, we seek to get a bigger share of the pie. And we need to engage our workers in what some may call labor economics, what some may call political economy, where we can show that the value of our labor power is not being adequately compensated for. And therein lies the difference in terms of what can be used as profit or what goes towards the worker. And therefore, we need to also advance that what we seek to do is to empower our workers. And here is where the politics comes into play. We must not sell our soul to politicians in terms of what we call the traditional politicians, but we must not be afraid as workers to support a political organization once we make our demands, and to go further than that, to form and organize our own political parties. Obviously, strategies and tactics will have to come into play here as to the way forward. And here, I must pay homage to a very brave brother, Comrade Watson Drew, in terms of the formation of his political organization, while at the same time holding on to trade union activities, because the interests meets. And we can have our differences, and we need to have our differences, and we need to haggle over issues. But there's a common thread that ought to bind us. And that common thread has to do betterment for the working class. And here, when we speak of the working class, we are not just speaking of what we call employees, but we're speaking about the people who, in relation to the means of production, stands on a particular side of the fence. We know that that distinction today is a bit more difficult because in the earlier period that my brother Atkins spoke about, the means of production and work was more clearly defined. But today, we have the issue of what one will call the technology, what some call the intelligentsia, for want of a better word, where the distinction, it is hardly cutlass and fork again, or it is just much more than what you call manual labor. So much so to the extent that a large section of our working class now see themselves no longer as workers, but they see themselves above workers, the working class, because they sit in an air-conditioned office and there's nothing wrong with that, right? But in relation to the boss, because they are closer to the boss, or they're closer to the management office, and they do not see themselves as ordinary workers. And last point I'll make before I conclude, it is ironic, and I'm using this appeal to our people, that most of us who comes from the working class, from the poor, the marginalized in society, when we get an opportunity to further our education, and we come back as trained professionals, we find ourselves at the service of the employer class, turning around and making life difficult for ordinary working people. And here, permit me, if I were to just pull out one profession, we have witnessed these days that the legal fraternity is led by a number of lawyers from the working class who use their intellect to try to whittle away from workers those interpretations that we have of labor rights. And our doctors and others who are qualified from the working class, and some of who have gotten state-funded scholarships, come back and rather be of greater service to the society. We find quite a number of these intellectuals and professionals do not turn around and give service to the community. Comrades, I make the case that we must advance, even if what you call just sloganeering, because these things play a role. In the Grenada Revolution, the billboard said, some said, not a second without the people, not a day without the struggle. And these served as reminders of our responsibility to the wider society. And I'm confident that the labor movement, with the assistance of this discussion that we are having, and Cipriani, in an organized way, in terms of this kind of discussions, will help build a consciousness. What is missing is that consciousness. And COVID-19 has provided this extremely important avenue for us, because we must use this opportunity to re-engineer society, because it has showed us that it traditionally looked down upon people who are the frontline workers, the gas station attendants, the sanitation workers, the nurses, the doctors, those who have not been made permanent, those who have not been regularized, have been traditionally looked down upon, are those who have carried the society, and we owe them this duty. Comrades, I rest my case that we have a lot of work to do, but I'm confident that we can do it. Thank you very much, comrade.
And this is why I was so looking forward to having Comrade Andrew Lewis on the discussion, following Atkins's poetic historical presentation, raising themes that for me were reminiscent of Derek Walcott's look at the Caribbean, at the development of the Caribbean. Brother Lewis comes along now and he picks up several of Atkinson's themes. He looks at the importance of a wider social agenda, not just terms and conditions for the labor movement, and talked about how the Grenada Revolution looked to create a just society. And as part of that just society, the revolution was a part of strengthening the labor movement. And in a kind of circular manner, the revolution strengthened the labor movement, but the labor movement believed in the ideals and ideology of the working people, which is what made the revolution able to serve the people. One of the very interesting parts of Brother Andre's discussion was going back to the importance of the Black Power movement, and just going forward from where Atkins had left off. I'm sure if Atkins had half an hour, we'd have, instead of 20 minutes, we'd have been all down into the Black Power movement as well. And then Brother Andrew looked at kind of the failing of ideology, that period of failing of ideology in the region, when he talks about the growth of individualism and consumerism, and the way it had a negative impact on ideological consciousness and consciousness building in the region. In a similar way as George de Pena once said, the labor movement's failure has been the result of its success, creating almost a wealthy worker who now has something to lose. Another interesting point that Brother Andre raised was the role of music in consciousness building, and the global recognition of Bob Marley and Peter Tosh as revolutionary artists. And you will see their music all over the world, wherever revolution is taking place. He threw in Sparrow as one of the people who stokes that kind of consciousness. And I would like to add two of my favorites, Junior Gong and Chronix, as part of the movement. I'm sure we all have our own favorites who we can put in this conscious category. Most importantly, Brother Andre said that labor must make no apologies for seeking to get more for the working class, for the value of our labor power. And if you cannot, labor movement in the Caribbean. So without further ado, we want to move on to our third presenter, and that is Miss Joan French from Jamaica. Joan has promoted feminist action throughout the Caribbean since the late 1960s. As leading member of the Sistren Theatre Collective, Joan has been associated with the Women's Resource and Outreach Center since its inception, and is a founding member of the Caribbean Association for Feminist Research and Action. She has also worked as a lecturer in the Department of Modern Languages at the UWI and at the Institute of Gender and Development Studies through the Regional Coordinating Office. Joan was the first Caribbean person to hold a program post in the UNICEF Regional Office for the Americas and the Caribbean in Bogota, Colombia, where she served as Regional Advisor for Gender from 1996 to 2008. As Chief of Gender for UNICEF from 1998 to 2003, she led the thrust for inclusion of gender analysis and action in every area of UNICEF programming. Since her retirement in 2007, Joan has served the UN as interim resident representative for UNICEF in the Comoros Islands and as interim director for the UN Women Multi-Country Office based in Barbados. She has also carried out consultancies for UNICEF. Ms. French has promised that she is not pulling any punches and we may not enjoy some of her presentation, which means that we look forward very much for what she's about to say. Ms. French, the floor is yours.
Mute, okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for this invitation, which I feel not so well qualified to do because I do not really consider myself a trade unionist, although I have headed a teachers union in Jamaica the National Union of Democratic Teachers, which did in fact do some very important work to advance the rights of women, and in particular, getting the maternity leave for women regardless of marital status. And I think the revolutionary content of that may not be so apparent unless you understand that until that time, only married teachers were allowed to get maternity leave. So this was a big status quo change. Anyhow, my presentation, which I hope somehow somebody will put up, is entitled A Feminist Reflection on the Union Movement in the Caribbean. And I am considering, when we talk about the working class, that trade unions are the main working class institutions in the Caribbean. And I will be offering an appreciation and critique from my perspective as a feminist whose practice has been largely with initiatives by or in favor of working class women. My examples, because of the limitations of my knowledge, will be drawn mainly from the Jamaican experience and history. Having listened to the other presentations, I just want to say that from the perspective from which I'm coming is that only a small proportion of the most fundamental of society's workers are represented by trade unions in the Caribbean today. And therefore, working women have had to go outside the unions to advance their issues. In looking at how this has happened, I'd like to go back a little bit to the colonial times and the colonial heritage of the trade union movement, because those responsible unions that I think Akin spoke about, by the time that version of trade unionism was introduced to the Caribbean in the wake of the late 1920s and 1930s riots, under the tutelage of the colonial authorities, but of course also with the collaboration of the local political authorities and on their recommendation, unions were conceived to only represent groups of workers in factories or in establishments where there were a considerable number of workers. Now, prior to that, there had been another form of unionism where tradesmen and like carpenters and cigar makers and so on, some of whom were employers, could organize, but that version really became passé, and partly because of some of the issues that have been mentioned before, because in some of them, both employers and employees were in the same union. It was difficult to deal with that. So it excluded those people. But this new form of organization of unions also excluded women, the majority of whose work was not in factories or those establishments, but in homes as paid or unpaid workers, or in the fields as paid or unpaid workers, in bars and other such establishments where barmaids, for example, worked alone or were few. So that the whole business of collective bargaining, as it came to be applied, excluded most of the female workforce. And that collectivity assumed this group of workers in a particular workplace. Now, gradually, the old form of unions died out, and this was the form that became dominant. Now, what happened to women then? What happened to women workers? We all know that the Moyne Commission was set up to look into the cause of the disturbances in the 30s and so on. But the proposed remedial action was highly influenced by the dominant view of women's place, which was held in the British metropolis at the time. The hearings were held there, and only token women were invited to participate, largely due to their own insistence and efforts. These included Jamaican feminists Una Marson and Amy Bailey. And we have to remember that the dominant philosophy concerning the place of women in the British metropolis at the time was that woman's place was in the home with a male breadwinner supporting her and her children. Professions eventually were open to educated middle-class women, but only those associated with childcare and the social services. And that is how teaching and nursing became the majority professional occupations of women in the Caribbean. You can skip the slide a little bit. Yeah, so go on, next slide. Well, go on, right. So that's happened. This is how teaching and nursing became the majority occupations. Okay, moving on. Now, in the Caribbean, post-abolition ex-slave societies, working women were encouraged, coming out of the recommendations of the Moyne Commission, to choose wageless housework over the hardships of very poorly paid wage labor on the plantations. There was no recommendation for collective bargaining on behalf of these women by the Moyne Commission. So that what happened was that out of that Moyne Commission report, the recommendation for what to do about women was to encourage them to get married and have husbands who would be responsible for them and look after them while they took responsibility for the housework and the childcare and all these other things. And I call it a statistical ejection of women from the workforce because it was deliberate and it was achieved and reflected in the way that census data was collected after the Moyne Commission report. Moving on. If you compare the 1921 and the 1943 censuses, one before and one after the Moyne Commission, shows that the number of women working in agriculture declined drastically while the number of men increased. Moving on. And here is the data. So that we find, for example, that in 1921, we had 125,400 women working in agriculture. And by 1943, we are told that it's only 45,600. Whereas male labor in agriculture moved from 160,000 plus to 183,000 plus, reflecting the shift towards work as defined by a male thing and women being pushed into the home. Moving on. So how do we know that this was deliberate? There are two, there was a Labor Department report in 1944 and a sample survey in 1953. I'm sorry, the slides should have been the other way around. But in the 1953 population sample survey, this is a quotation from it. In 1943, women and children were thrown out of the labor force by the manner in which the definition of gainfully occupied was applied. The 1943 gainfully occupied concept was not closely comparable to the productive population of earlier censuses. Next slide. So if we look at the Labor Department report for 1944, they are very specific. For census purposes, a gainful occupation is one by which a person who pursues it earns money, performs a service, or assists with the production of goods for money. Children working at home on general household duties or chores at times at other work are not considered to be gainfully employed. Similarly, women doing housework in their own homes without salary or wages were returned as homemakers and not considered as being among the gainfully employed. And moving on, in actual fact, what happened was that there were marriage campaigns participated on also by some middle-class women who thought that was the way to go to dignify the labor of women. And between the marriage campaigns and the opposition to birth control and all these things, women were gradually shifted away from wage labor which I'm not telling you was a wonderful, and it had, I mean, they were paid half of the wages or less of men and so on, and it was hard, but they had some money in their hands. Then they were shifted to a place where they were now dependent totally on the earnings of a male, right? And you have to remember that also at that time, in that period of history, when a woman married following the British colonial pattern, if she had any assets or earnings, she was by law obliged to turn them over to the male partner, male husband. These are facts that are not very well known because our history remains his story, and we do not yet have sufficient of her story. So this is what women went through, having to give over. But women, whenever there is oppression or whenever there is injustice, there will be a fight. And so women did fight back. They started trying to rear small livestock and having kitchen gardening. They did higgling from these kitchen gardens. And they also sometimes did higgling of the produce of other farmers for a fee. They learned craft, to sell craft, crocheting. I'm 76 years old, so I was part of the crochet generation. You know, you learn to crochet and to embroider and those things. Some of them had food stalls, and some migrated to the city to do domestic work mainly, or they were called, in commercial establishments, these big women were called shop, quote unquote, girls. Now, in the migration to the city in Kingston, in this case, they went into light manufacturing, such as match factories, I suppose that's what it was called at the time, or they went into the garment industry. But a lot of the garment industry at that time began to work, do outwork, because the women were now at home, but they needed the money, and the garment factories could pay them less because they weren't counted as workers, because they were not at the factory base. And they also wanted the money because they wanted some money, although they were now tied to the home. And in fact, there are statistics to show that at a certain point in the garment industry, 80% of the workers were working from home. That is the period when the sewing machine became what I call a feminist kind of symbol. Because when you had a sewing machine, you now had this possibility to get work for a wage. And formerly, there was a color dimension to it, because mulatto women were the dressmakers of the past, but now Black women could now enter this work area by having a machine. So there was this thing about a sewing machine. Having a sewing machine was a status symbol. And so Black women could now enter a work area previously dominated by mulatto women. Moving on. Next slide. Now, not all male trade, well, all the unions were male-led, and some male women union leaders did try to break through that barrier. Bain Alls, for example, attempted the unionization of women in isolated, I'm missing the D, non-factory situations, of barmaids, for example, and he called meetings outside of working hours to accommodate their attendance. I don't think Bain Alls understood that their working hours did not end when they were working in the bar. So the efforts did not survive. Now, the Bustamante Industrial Trade Union also tried to organize domestics. However, he was a Roman Catholic and a little bit sort of dictatorial, I have to say. So he decided that since birth control and the marriage campaign were more in line with his religious views, he was in opposition to them. So working class women were more drawn to the more open and consultative trade union council, which organized substantially in factories with a high percentage of female workers. The officers, however, were all male. Continuing. Now, progressive politics. We have to, I personally wonder about what is progressive very often. I totally endorse the comments of Comrade Andre about the unique achievements of the Grenada Revolution, which I had the privilege of interfacing with in Grenada. But there are times when what is considered progressive in one way is not progressive for women, because there is no gender analysis. There is no questioning of what the impact is having on the wages and income and welfare of women. So when, for example, Norman Manley of the People's National Party got this agreement for the British to fund Jamaica welfare, the Jamaica welfare policies were geared in line with the male breadwinner concept, and this concept that the male head of household was the one who had the resources, owned the land, and so on. For example, there was a land reform program, but to get land, you had to be a head of household. And in most of the cases, over 90% of the cases, only men were considered heads of household. The only women who fought, there were a few women who fought to be considered heads of household, and it was because they had no husband and they fought, right? Now, as I said before, on marriage at the time, women were obliged to turn up by law, to turn all their assets over to their husband. I witnessed that as a child. I lived with my aunt and I witnessed her as a teacher giving her salary to her husband at the end of the month. It's called part of what made me a feminist. Now, women who chose to work, no, go back to the earlier one, right? Women who chose to work, for example, in the civil service, had to forego marriage. And that is why when we look back in the history, a lot of the women in the civil service were what they then called spinsters, what we would now call single women. They didn't marry, because if they married, they had to resign, because marriage was a job and you couldn't do it and work outside, right? So people like Una Marston and Amy Bailey, a lot of these women who took the position that they wanted to be professionals or work or whatever, had to give up this other side of their lives. In fact, as late as the 1980s, in my work with the Sistine Theatre Collective in the sugar area of Hayes, Clarendon, housing provided did not ensure inclusion on the titles of the names of wives or common law partners. And we had to do a lot of drama and education work to even build the confidence of the women that they could make representation to change the situation, which they did take action. Now, I've heard talk about Marxism and capitalism and so on, and neoliberalism, and they exist. These things are real, these are real ideologies. But let me tell you, from where I sit, looking at what's happening to working class women, they have one essential thing in common. Both only consider workers outside the home as workers, and both accept and promote the factory-based or whatever, commercial establishment approach to collective bargaining. They have that in common. And it is one of the problems when women seek to interface, or feminists anyway, seek to join in movements that are of this kind, they cannot find a space. They cannot find a space for women. Working women cannot find a space for their real lived experience in many of these organizations. Continuing. Next slide. So, no, go the one before. Right. Now, the critiques of Marxism that I have heard, I have lectured at the university and I know a lot of the history people, but a lot of the critiques that I have heard are critiques that have been made by men following the same dynamic of a male-led ideological construct. But there are women who have countered the limitations of Marxism, looking at it from a women's workers' point of view. Next one. Next slide. So for example, Selma James, The Wages for Housework campaign and organizing began with a critique of Marxism by Selma James and Maria de la Costa. Selma James was intimately aware of the debates on Marxism, being the wife of Trinidadian Trotskyist Nello C.L.R. James, and an active participant. She did all of the, you know, fixing up the things and the snacks and so on. But she took part in the discussions, an active participant in the discussions that Nello James held with young Caribbean intellectuals at their home in London in the 1960s. I was privileged to participate in those discussions. Selma was adamant that the Marxist analysis of working class labor did not include much of the labor of women, and that there was a link between unpaid labor of women and why women were paid so lower than men outside of the home. Next slide. Now, Andaye, who passed on, I say here 2020, but it's actually, well, she passed on in 2019, is a Ghanese activist who helped lead women out of the Working People's Alliance of Walter Rodney to form the group Red Thread. And she was also the leading figure of the Wages for Housework campaign in the Caribbean. Her main organizational vehicle was Red Thread, which supported women to value and organize around their work that was not counted. Next slide. And this is something I have to correct. She passed on in 2019, actually. Maintained to the end that she was a Marxist. She was a strong critic of the feminist movement in the region for not sufficiently taking on the issues of working class, indigenous, and poor women in general. Yet she was a member of the Caribbean Association for Feminist Research and Action, formed in 1985, which claimed the feminist name over wide opposition and participated in many initiatives of feminist organizing besides those around housework and care work. And I want to say here that in my interface with Marxist and Fabian socialist organizations in Jamaica, as soon as you mentioned the word feminist, you were accused of dividing the struggle. You were doing something wrong. I was actually sent, a member of the the WPJ, Workers' Party of Jamaica, was actually sent to my house to tell me that I should not go to the founding meeting of the Caribbean Association for Feminist Research and Action because that would be dividing the struggle. And at the time, I considered myself a socialist supporting the democratic issues of the Manley government at the time, right? So there is a tension between what is considered progressive and what actually happens to the experience of women within these organizations, which is what has led to the establishment and expansion of the feminist movement in the Caribbean. Now, we have done some time use studies, and they're not the only, I mean, very little has been done in this regard because we have not had either the resources or the perspectives that have floated to the top about this. But there have been some attempts to measure the kind of additional labor of women outside of their paid work. And in the CAFRA's Women in Agriculture project, in the 1988 report records women doing up to 6,000 hours per year of unrecognized and unpaid domestic labor. And in addition to their recognized productive work, for Dominica, the figure was 4,000 plus hours. Next thing. And Dr. Adra Nora of UWI-Mona did a study that found that women were doing basically twice the amount of home maintenance and that kind of thing. Yeah, that study, yeah. So now in 1975, with the growth of consciousness about how women's labor was not being taken into account in the traditional and classic union movement and political ideologies and so on, women in Iceland in 1975 went on strike. And the result of the women's strike was that society came to a halt as a result. The strike was organized by women's organizations, including the Wages for Housework campaign. Women did not go to their paid jobs or do any housework or childcare for the whole day. Next slide. Next one. And from the continuing work of women around this issue of their labor that was not recognized, the 1995 Beijing Platform for Action includes a commitment to measure and value unpaid work, especially women's family care, in national accounts. And Trinidad and Tobago was the first country in the world to pass a law to implement it, the Trinidad and Tobago Unremunerated Work Act. Now, I have not followed up. I do not have any information on how this has proceeded regionally or internationally. Next slide. Next slide. Now, so what is the point of all of this? My point is that the women's strike made the point that the unrecognized work that women do, whether it's unrecognized because they get less pay, and I give tribute to all the countries that now have equal pay for equal work, but some of the work is not equal, because what we're doing is we're giving equal pay for equal work according to what is defined as men's work. So the women's strike made the point that the unrecognized that women do is the very foundation on which society rests. The kind of organizing and advocacy needed in this situation cannot be contained within union structures as they have come to be defined in the Caribbean. This does not mean that there is nothing that unions can do. Next slide. Now, this list is a very tentative list, because in the final analysis, the positioning of unions at workplaces allows them to have real conversations and the same kind of consciousness raising that Atkins would be doing about the history of Garvey and all of these things. Women also need consciousness raising about what is their history as women in the Caribbean space and in the post-colonial, well, I don't think it's post-colonial really, I don't like the term, but in the post-slavery, post-emancipation space. But here are some of the things that have come out from some of the conversations which may be considered and some may not be relevant and so on, because in the final analysis, there's a lot of work to be done. Childcare at the workplace, breastfeeding breaks and spaces. I will never forget how upset I was when I was in front of a class teaching, because I was a teacher, and here would be this breast milk wetting up the whole of my clothes, and then I had to press out the milk and leave in the morning. I mean, it's drama, right? There's the whole question of healthy birth control that gives women choices outside of the male-female power dynamic, because some women, because of this dynamic with partners, they can't be known to be using birth control, right? So they end up having children that they didn't really want, which increases their labor in that direction when they may have desires to go in other directions in terms of their education, development, and growth. Equal opportunity for training and education in all fields for women and girls. I didn't hear any of the presenters mention training programs, and I don't know if that is something that the unions do. But you know, there's space for advocacy for this, because even at the Caribbean Development Bank, where I did some work for a while, there was a gentleman who told me that he didn't put women on construction projects because it was not appropriate to females to be working on construction projects. So he wrote them out of his projects as a way of being feminist in his view, right? Well, at that day I gave up the teaching because I decided I was utterly and totally useless and ineffective. Promotion of shared housework and childcare between women and men. Some men do it better. Some women really don't have the inclination. Benefits for family caregivers, including mothers. And this may seem unthinkable, but it actually Some of this was actually tried in Venezuela under when Hugo Chavez was alive. I do not know what has happened to it since. But healthcare for caregivers, including mothers. No, go back to the previous one. I don't know where I am. Yeah, that, right. Post-childbearing training and opportunities. There are countries, and I gather that Trinidad is one. I don't know. I hear that actually when you reach a certain age, regardless of whether you're working or not, you get a pension. I don't know much about it. I haven't really continued my work in the field. But post-childbearing training and opportunities, caregiver leave. Caregiver, not just sick leave for yourself, but what happens if your child is sick? What happens if you have your mother looking after your elderly mother? Because women, talking about neoliberalism, by the way, and structural adjustment and all these things that are happening, all of the things that the state has given up doing, because in this new world in which we live, the state is no longer serving the population or the electorate. The state is abandoning those kinds of roles, right? And so you have cutbacks in healthcare, cutbacks in education. We have 220,000 children out of school who cannot be found because now that we have online learning, they do have tablet and they do have Wi-Fi and so on. And rather than putting those things as priorities, right? We are now still looking to see what is the minimal thing we can do as a state so that people will think we are doing something. This is where the problem is. This is where the problem is. And it can be done because yes, you say I worked with UNICEF, I also worked in Africa for 5 years. And I'm telling you, hear me say today, until as Caribbean societies, we can deal with the fact that our children are growing up in unacceptable circumstances, we will not have new societies free of crime, and we will not have workers ready to do the work that the societies need. Next slide. I wish to note as part of the presentation that for the first time since 1930s, women who were previously considered unorganizable, excuse the coinage of the word, are now organizing. Trinidad has a Wages for Housework campaign led by Clotilde Walcott until her death and now by her daughter. And in Jamaica, we have a Jamaica Household Workers Union, which continues to struggle with the challenges of declaring itself a union and finding the right organizing modality. Because in actual fact, the union modality that is dominant now is not filling the bill, but they're struggling to find it. Now, these two organizations, along with others in the region and in the world, supported efforts at the level of the UN to get UN Convention 189, which seeks to improve the recognition, conditions of work, and so on of domestics and caregivers. And the ILO has defined out of it the ILO Decent Work Agenda, which is providing a framework for the advocacy of these organizations. So that's where women are going. And I guess I may be seen as being a little bit off the table for saying it, but as unions are, that's been said, as unions are presently constructed, yeah, go on to the next one. This is not so important. The women are having to go beyond, the women workers are having to go beyond unions as they're presently structured to get responses to the issues that face them. There is an example I did not put in here. In the 1980s, during the time of democratic socialism, when there was this democratic opening under the government of Michael Manley in Jamaica, we were able to get legislation passed, not because Michael Manley was in government, not because of democratic socialism, but because Beverly Andis Manley, his wife, was a committed feminist who did the work within the government and within the party, and in collaboration with left-wing women of the Committee of Women for Progress, to push the government to get maternity leave for all working women, to get domestics recognized as workers, because before that they were not. They were not included in minimum wage legislation because they were not considered workers. Lynette Vassell and myself and Rosina Wilshire did the first piece of research to demonstrate why domestic workers needed to be included in minimum wage legislation, but we are not trade unionists, right? We got minimum wage legislation, we got maternity leave, we got legislation that determined that not only married not only the children of married couples could benefit from maintenance of fathers, but that fathers were also to be included where the children were what was called before then illegitimate, but we decided there were no illegitimate children, right? So what we call the bastardy law, it says no bastard, not there again was the song that was sung, right? So talking about the person who, I think it was Andre who mentioned the important role of music. We had a lot of campaign songs that spoke to the efforts that were being made to put women in a different, working women in a different relationship to employment, to work, to state, and to the recognition of their labor. So now the feminist movement continues. There's another generation coming up. They're actually moving into wider arenas, not as economistic as before, but all of these new groups are women-led. They are very clear that female autonomy is their framework. We do not wish to be told what to do by men, either in the home or anywhere else. So they're looking for equal power. They're looking for sexuality education and sex education for both girls and boys. Because believe me, I have been a teacher in school, and the level and the dearth of information available to young people cannot but lead to the misuse of their sexuality, which goes in the end against their own interests. Challenging the gender binomial. Who cares whether you're heterosexual or you're gay or you're a person, right? So how do we deal with that? People have equal rights, reproductive rights, maternity leave, care leave, and also choice. This whole choice of whether you have children or not. I myself am presently involved in a struggle to decriminalize abortion, because now women who are known to have abortions either have to go to people who are not, qualified to perform them, and then many times end up dead. They die. But the law still says that they can be imprisoned up to life, and the persons who assist them can be imprisoned for up to 3 years, right? Self-care, people are saying, look here, we don't have nobody else looking after us, so we better look after ourselves, right? So look after yourself as well. We are not in this charity mode where the middle class is saying, oh, we are looking for these poor working women. No, working women are saying, we the working women, go and look after ourselves. We're not going to, we're not going to just be looking out for others. And of course, they're trying to come to terms with this new work world, which I think was mentioned either by Andrea or Atkins, the digital, this and the computer and the that and the that. And they're working against the digital gender divide because they realize that if they don't know how to manage it, they will not survive. They have to survive within it, so that women are down to surviving. I think the next is the last slide. So women have to break out of the union thing, because women's labor interests cannot be contained within the still patriarchal union or political structures that presently exist and do not recognize and represent much of their labor. Amen. Thank you. Yeah, laugh after Mr. Ian. It's not funny. You don't know what to say, no?
No, not at all. That was good. That was good. I was actually getting the cue to tell you that the time was up, but you know, no, I couldn't even do that for trying to follow you and look at the presentation and everything at the same time. I have to tell you, ma'am, that you said absolutely nothing to me that was stunning or new or different from my own personal experience and upbringing, coming from a family that essentially was and is female led in almost every generation that I experienced. I'm almost afraid to try to summarize what you were saying for the benefit of participants, but just to remind people of some of the important things that you pointed out. Yeah, you pointed out the deliberate statistical ejection of women from the workforce. You pointed out the way in which productive work was made male, and then the way in which women were systematically excluded and made dependent on men. I especially like your description of the re-entry of women into the formal workforce, and utilizing one of my favorite terms, the shop girl, which I could never understand. Why are there not shop boys next to shop girls, but apparently there are shop girls. And your point about the sewing machine as a feminist symbol, for me, is a very interesting and important one, because one of my first jobs was actually working in a Singer sewing machine company selling sewing machines. So that's a very beautiful point. And that trust that you've made about women not being able to find a space in the ideological constructs of labor, and probably in the wider theoretical social science constructs as well, is so important. And the need for women to do exactly what we're saying that labor has to do: make your own space, and demand inclusion. One of your last points was so important, and that was the way in which the work of women in creating their own space and in defining their own ideological framework is the thing that actually is the basis of the definition of decent work. And so the entire society must recognize that not only is women's work, as you pointed out, the foundation of the entire society, but women's work is also the basis upon which we can all liberate ourselves in the context of work. And move towards a better and more equal treatment in the workforce. As you said, female autonomy has to become the basis of their own ideological framework. And so, Ms. French, I thank you very much for your presentation. It was one of the best, I think, presentations during the entire Labor Week. If you need to shake things up, you go ahead and shake. You just go ahead and shake. I know, looking at Atkins, he enjoyed the presentation from beginning to end. And so what we want to do now is to take a look at some of the questions that people have been asking, and present those to our panelists, and hear what you have to say. So I want to take one of the earlier questions that came for Mr. Vidal. And that question is, how relevant is the discussion on the class consciousness in considering contributing factors to slavery? If I can repeat that, how relevant is the discussion on class consciousness in considering contributing factors to slavery? There's a second question, Atkins, that may be related to it, so I might as well give it to you at the same time. And that question was slavery a product on dissonance amongst the people who enabled slavery? Was slavery a product of, well, I suppose that is of dissonance amongst the people who enabled slavery?
I'm not 100% sure that I understand the nature of the question. But if I'm to guess, I think the question really has to do with why would I put or ground working class consciousness in the period of enslavement? And I think that is probably what is being challenged there. And the reason I do that is because, again, when we talk about the period of enslavement, we are talking about people. We've had too many narratives where we agree that the African didn't really exist as a person during that period. But when you empower the African as a person, then you begin to see them as a worker under horrific conditions of enslavement, dealing with absolute atrocities. And so their consciousness of their condition could only start in that under those circumstances. And the advent of emancipation and other things didn't necessarily change the conditions. And so I am suggesting that when we talk about working class consciousness, and as Sister French had said, when you talk about the deconstruction of humanity, and it's all of us, it's dealing with how we treat women, how we treat children, how all of that is part of the bad and horrible foundation of the society that we have, and rebuilding all of those elements is how we move forward. And that, so our working class consciousness is not about salaries and wages. Our working class consciousness is about how we rebuild ourselves, how we rebuild a society that reflects us, reflects all of us, and more importantly, includes all of us, because we have this capacity to decide that one person's pain, and I made this point in another panel, that one person's pain is more important than another person's at any given point in time. So we aggregate how we give life to a campaign, how we give life, or which issues we give life to at any given point in time. But those things are constructs of power, and let's not fool ourselves, right? What is important at a point in time is a construct of power, and we have to be aware of that. But when you have a social or working class consciousness that understands that all of us are together, that the working class is one grouping, whether they are male or female, woman, man, child, whatever, the way you approach the issues will be very different from how I think we approach them now, right? And that is why I'm grounding it in slavery, because my position is that that is the starting point for the kinds of relationships that we have in the region.
Thank you, Atkins. I just want to announce to the audience that we will be staying an extra 15 to 20 minutes to facilitate discussion, given the length of the presentations, if the presenters agree.
And by me.
Okay, there we go. We have agreement from the presenters. Comrade Andre, I have a question for you. And the question is, though the historical ideologies have shaped us, and by us I believe it's the labor movement, the question is, how or why did this docility among the working class step in? We've had so many movements, the Black Power movement, the Grenada Revolution. How have we come to this state now?
Very interesting question. And I think it has a lot to do with, well, certainly in the case of the Grenada Revolution, the implosion of the Grenada Revolution contributed significantly to a sort of retreat, right? Because remember, you're dealing with the US as a superpower, and they would have used the psychops and all of the resources to try to ensure that not just in Grenada, but in the region, that what we call progressive thought processes was submerged for a long period of time. I think that that's there. And also, given the fact that in that period, and I'm also linking it to the Cold War issue and the crash of the change in the Cold War period, a lot of resources for the labor movement, fortunately or unfortunately, came from organizations that were competing for dominance in the region. So there were a lot of training, right? There were a lot of classes, there were a lot of investments in those sort of developments. And after they moved out of the region, a vacuum was created. But we did not find creative ways and means of using our local people to do that educational work. So that docileness, and history goes through those different troughs and dips, yes, troughs and thing. But what is required? I want to address what is required. Is that sort of discussion that we are having here, and the need for recognizing this and putting the systems in place to build that particular consciousness.
Thank you, sir. I have a question for Sister French. And well, this is an interesting question. I just want to preface this question by giving Sister French one of my experiences in work where I was a supervisor to a pregnant cashier in one of the banks in Trinidad and Tobago. And at one point in time, she had to go to rest in the restroom. And my manager actually called me to go into the ladies' restroom to determine if the woman was actually ill or if she was just faking on the basis of her pregnancy. And the sad thing was my manager was female. But anyway, so the question is, can the labor movement, which continues to demonstrate gender division in leadership, be reshaped to fully represent the interests of women workers?
I think that it is clear from my presentation that I do not think so. I think that the labor movement can make advances and that it can be better than it is. And I think just to respond a little bit to what you said also, the question of opinions or attitudes to these issues is not determined by whether it is a woman or a man. Mm-hmm. Patriarchy is supported by many women, and many men have better attitudes, right? So it's about vision and perspective and how one sees things, how your mind is. I think either Andrea or Akin said that. It's what you think, right? So it's not male, female, it is ideological positioning in relation to the issues. But the unions cannot, as presently constructed, represent women. I think I said that very clearly, all working women, but they can improve what they are doing by responding to the gender needs of their female constituencies as they exist, and to doing more work in terms of what, for lack of a better word, might be called consciousness raising of the female unionized workers, and increasing their participation in defining what it is that unions strive for, what they go for, what they try to get done. So even if they, as they're presently constructed, they leave out a lot of female labor, there is still a lot of work to be done within the unions, because women are still, they may be the majority on the shop floor, they are minority in the management. And even if they're majority on the shop floor, their issues do not float up. And in fact, in just after the 1930s uprising, I remember banana carriers, who were mainly women at the time, going on strike, and the management refused to talk to the women because they said that the men were more sensible and more likely to agree to whatever they were you know, so the marginalization of women and their issues is a real matter. And I think following what many of you have said, and Ian too, we're talking about the societal issues. So women are not just these individual workers looking for a salary and wages, as many people have said, but they're members of a society who are experiencing the impact of the arrangements of that society on themselves as workers. And that is the perspective that I think the unions can begin to take.
Thank you much, ma'am. Atkins, I have another question for you. I'm sure you could write a book on this one. What is the relationship between the decline of Butlerism and the rise of the PNM?
A question sound like sedition and lost work,
Well,
all tied up in one.
how about it, brother? How about it?
Okay, it's public knowledge that one of the first speeches that Williams made in Woodford Square when he returned was to undermine Butler. And the point that he made was that this is the end of the era of this is the end of the donkey cart, this is the era of the jet plane. And that while Butler attacked the heart, he attacked the mind. And it was clear that what was being done is that the labor movement and the mass movement that had emerged out of the 30s and 40s was now being taken over by what we'd call a professional middle class, whose ideological positions were very different to the labor leadership in the 30s. And this was not a Trinidad and Tobago problem. This happened across the region, where you almost had self-made leaders, well, colonial-made leaders being implanted into the countries to then become the front runners for the independence transition. And I'm saying transition deliberately. So what Butler, the position Butler found himself in was that you now had a leadership that was endorsed by the colonial authority for all intents and purposes. And I'm not saying that lightly. In the 1956 election, the PNM did not win the majority of seats to actually have Eric Williams declared as the premier. They did not have enough. The PNM has often argued about win alone, lose alone. However, in that 1956 election, the People's National Movement sat with then Governor Beetham and negotiated that 2 of his appointed members to the Legislative Council would be PNM persons. And that is how the PNM ended up with the majority seats in 1956 to get Williams as the Prime Minister. When in fact, Butler had seats in the Parliament. And if in fact the PNM was about the working class people, the PNM could have made an alliance with the 4 seats that Butler had. I think it was 4. The 4 seats that Butler had in the Parliament and get the majority. But they went instead against the people and went to the colonial authorities to make an alliance. And the rest, as they say, is history. Come 1963, 1965, 1970, 1971, 72, 73. And we could go on and on about the relationship between the People's National Movement and the Butlerites in this country. All right, so if I'm not at work tomorrow, I got my sedition charge organized, yeah.
Well, that's actually why I asked the question. But anyway, I have 2 more questions in the time that we have related left us, and I'd like to address the first to Brother Andre, and then the second to Sister Dawn. Comrade Andre, the question is, given what you've described, I think about the working class and what has happened in recent times, can there be another revolution in the Caribbean?
Well, the will of the people will determine that. And all things are possible. I may not say encourageable, but we also have to understand what is revolution, because revolution is not necessarily in terms of guns and those sort of things. But I want to encourage a continuous revolution in our thought processes, right, and in our attitude to society. And because the revolution seeks to change the order of society. And yes, therefore, that must be encouraged. And we look forward to that. And that is part of what we are doing here, right? And in a controversial way, just as how West Indies cricket, the cricketers are a reflection of what is happening in a wider society, we must not just look at things in silo, but we all have that contribution to make. We're a reflection of what is happening generally.
I'm very disappointed, sir, in you for the first time since I've known you. I did not expect you to go into that open wound, which you will just never heal for me. But thank you for your answer. We're over 7. We are at 7:07. I have another question for Sister Joan, and the question is, there it is. Women's labor interests cannot be, as you said, contained within the still patriarchal union of political structures that presently exist. What do you then see as possible for strong collaborations?
My view is that what happens to working women will depend very largely on the strength of the women's movement, which, and my female friends may not agree with me on that, but I think that the women's movement, like the union movement, is suffering from the same sense of low and battling against very powerful forces. Right now, we are not in that positive mode, for example, that we in Jamaica were in the late 1980s. The political structures do not facilitate it. In fact, in certain instances, they actually oppose what the women's movement tries to do, even on critical issues like violence against women, right? And so the world, it is not just Jamaica or Trinidad, the world is at a low ebb. And the idea that only money counts and that anybody, the more you can make, the better. And if 5 people are millionaires, it's okay if the other 99% don't have food and the prices rise out of their pockets. That's the kind of thing we're having now. But that 99% where the food is rising out of the pockets, there's a limit to how long people are not going to allow themselves to die. And it can go in different directions. It can go in the directions of crime and things such as is happening in Jamaica now. Or it can feed into the conscientization and political forwardness of which others have spoken. But the leadership for that is currently lacking. We don't have a Maurice Bishop that I can see. There are sort of, what would I call it? Some indication of new perspectives coming out of Barbados and Antigua. But, you know, they would require a sort of bringing together where there's a kind of group like the New World Group, or when, you know, those kinds of people who would then analyze, dig out that information and throw it back to people, because people are being held to just survival. They are absolutely caught up in just trying to survive from day to day. So unless there's some leadership for thinking and analysis and consciousness raising, I don't see that right now. I think it's going to take some time, but I'm willing to be surprised. I never thought that I would live to see Nelson Mandela come out of prison or South Africa free, but I lived to see it. So if I could be surprised, I would be the happiest person in the world.
Thank you very much, ma'am. I have I saw a last question appear here. I don't know if we have time to take that. It's for you, Atkins. We take one more. The question goes, Traditionally, trade unions had big visible issues to fight, but now in 2021, it is a much more subtle fight where those in power have many more tools to quell any uprising. How then do you organize in a state such as this?
Right. Firstly, I don't think that they have more tools. What workers faced in the 1930s compared to what we face now is chalk and cheese. All right. I don't know that half of the workers now could even stand up to the kind of pressures that workers stood up to in the 1930s, in the absence of any kind of organized resistance, in the absence of any kind of legal protection. Workers died. Workers literally died in the 30s fighting for wages and salaries, for better housing, for better conditions. So that is not a comparison that I like to make necessarily. What I would like to suggest though is that, and I think Comrade French said it, Sister French said it, is that the world is a little different now. And neoliberalism, post this new colonial, which really is just a post-emancipation period, has created a condition of neutrality. And that's what we're talking about today. So you have persons who have embraced fully capitalism, embraced fully neoliberalism, embraced things like racism, embraced things like all kinds of other isms that are inimical to Caribbean people. And we've embraced them, internalized them, but we see them as a neutral position. So anyone who opposes neoliberalism is leftist, is Marxist, is communist, is bad. And we've internalized those things so that we have to understand as well the role of the Cold War. The Cold War shifted a lot of the conversation. And I always make the point, you know, that this is the era of all the young people now, and well, me too, you know, included, we enter the Marvel and the DC universe and so on. And Captain America, who is the Star Spangled Banner poster boy, uses the word comrade. Why does Captain America use the word comrade? But when Comrade Andre Lewis uses it, it's because he is part of some cult that is against everything that is good in this world. And that's because language also has a role to play. And it is not that things have changed, it is that the language has changed. And there are a lot more subtleties now in terms of how we speak about things, how we speak about people. So we don't even know that some of what we're saying is derogatory. We don't even know that some of what we're saying attacks people and offends people, or is even dangerous to ourselves, because the language has changed so much. We don't pay attention anymore. And that's another thing, that we just don't pay attention anymore. So all of those struggles are still there. They haven't gone anywhere. We just don't pay attention. In 1930s, and I'll wrap with this point here, read the Moyne Commission. The Moyne Commission identifies the following as some of the reasons for the uprisings in the 30s. Poor housing, is that fixed today? No. Poor water, is that fixed today? The answer to that is no. Issues with electricity, issues with health, issues with education, all of those things are identified, and none of those things are fixed today. So it's not that the problem is different. It is that the language has forced us into a false sense of security. And I always made the point, you know, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. Yes, I care a little bit about how you say it, but I'm more concerned about what you say, and even more so about why you say it. Because the why you say it is the ideological position that you're coming from. And I want to know where you're coming from when you speak to me. And I think that is what the issue is. And the reality is that at the leadership level, whether it is political or at the level of the unions, the consciousness is too low to be able to translate the language into something that explains to the mass of the population that what is happening is not in your interest. And that is the problem that I think we have.
Well, thank you very much, Atkins. I wish we had more time, and I wish that as moderator, I was allowed to engage in the discussion as fully as the panelists. This has been, as I said, one of the best panel discussions that I've been involved in, and I thought that yesterday's was that. But Sister French, you're not knitting out the park here, and you're definitely on the invitation list for almost anything else that we're doing. Yeah. To you, the viewers, I want to, in closing, thank you for being here with us tonight. I hope you enjoyed tonight's presentations as much as I did. I hope Sister French rocked your world as much as she did mine. We've been reminded of several things. We've been reminded that the level of materialism that we are experiencing today is undermining our ability to think of ourselves critically and consciously. It's undermining our ability to protect ourselves as workers and to protect our society. We've been reminded of our history and the importance of our ideology, of our construction of self, our incomplete process of constructing our identity, and the need to continue that process so that we may emerge a more whole, a more fair, and a better society. And we've been reminded that if you ain't fixing the state of women, you ain't doing nothing. Sister French, once again, thank you for that. All right, so thank you to the panel members, and I want to give a warm thank you to the members of the Elma Francois Institute for Research and Debate and the other members of the college staff who have made this week possible, who have been behind the scenes, ensuring that everything goes off as planned and is brought to you, the public. I want to thank the public for viewing, not just tonight, but for the entire week. And I invite you to go to the recordings and take another look or take your first look at the other presentations, the other panel discussions that we've had over the week. I guarantee you will enjoy them. Please complete our feedback forms on this session. You can find the link in the description box in the chat, and look out for our future events as we in Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies and the Elma Francois Institute for Research and Debate continue to engage on issues affecting labor and working people. Ladies and gentlemen, good night, and please be safe. COVID is still there, and the post-COVID world is actually now. Good night to everyone.
Thanks, comrades.
Thank you.
Yeah, take care.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, man. Later.